Hello, my name is John and I live in Crewe, Cheshire, here with my family. And for as long as I can remember, I've believed in God. And I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes explaining that to you just now. I believe in God as revealed to us in the pages of the Bible. I believe that God inspired the Bible to be written down and that we can be confident that when we turn to the Bible, what we have is God's message to men and women. And that it is in the Bible that we can learn about God. That's where we understand more about God, the Father, as is described to us. Now, when we open our Bibles, what we find is that God is described more in terms of his characteristics than he is in terms of his form, or in other words, what he is like more than what he looks like. A great example of this we find in our Old Testament. And it's an occasion where Moses said he wanted to see God, but he wasn't permitted to see God. But what he was permitted was a description of God's characteristics. Let me read this to you. The Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. Now that was taken from Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. And what we have there then is a list of characteristics that describe God to us. And as I just took you through those, I hope it was clear that God's presented to us in a very balanced way. So on the one hand, we hear about a God that is loving and gracious and merciful, but also a God that won't tolerate wickedness forever. So, in other words, a bit like the ideal parent, a father who is absolutely fair, is loving and compassionate and forgiving, but nonetheless is fair and won't tolerate evil to last forever or for it to go unpunished. So there's, if you like, an abstract description of God's characteristics. There's a really neat story we find in the New Testament. It's a parable told by Jesus, which describes to us really effectively in the form of the story what God's like. Now, the parable is known as the parable of the prodigal son, or sometimes it's called the parable of the lost son. And it's a parable about a man with two sons, where the youngest son asks for his inheritance, and he goes off into a foreign land and squanders that inheritance. And then realizing that he really has messed up, he decides to come back to his father, and he's got a speech ready for his father that basically asks him not to consider him a son anymore, because he's not worthy of that, but that he's considered a servant. And it's very interesting because this shines a light more than anything on the characteristics of the Father, and in so doing tells us a little more about what God is like. Now I'm reading to you now from Luke chapter 15 and verse 20. And he, the son, arose and came to his father, but when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf here and kill it. Let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. You see then, the father was desperate for the son to turn back to him. And as soon as he did, as soon as the father could see the son coming towards him, he was running out to meet him. He was desperate to be able to show him forgiveness. And that's what God's like. That's how God's presented to us in our Bibles, as a God who is desperate for men and women to turn to him, and that when they do, he's ready to forgive them. But it's balanced still, that wickedness couldn't go unpunished. So then, I believe in God. I believe that God wrote the Bible, or organized for men to write the Bible, but it being his message, and that the way that the God is presented to us is of a loving and ultimately fair Father. He's got a special relationship with Jesus, and that is of Jesus being his son, his only begotten son, we read about. And I'd like to bring you to a verse that really tells us about the relationship in a very simple way between God and Jesus. And it's in the second letter of Peter, chapter 1, and I'm reading from verse 17, where talking about Jesus, it says, "For he received from God the Father honor and glory when such a voice came to him from the excellent glory, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.'" It's very clearly spelt out to us then that the relationship that God has with Jesus, God is presented to us as a father, but he has a much closer relationship with Jesus as a father and son. It's nothing mysterious, nothing we can't understand. They're not conjoined together in some way that's very difficult for us to get our heads around. God is the Father and Jesus is the Son. So, as I said at the beginning, I believe in God, the God of the Bible, who's presented to us as a benign and a loving Father.